The coffee pot hissed on the burner, its brown steam curling toward the ceiling fan that barely moved the August heat. In 1980, the Silver Spur Diner sat like a metal box on Highway 95, 23 miles south of Mercury, Nevada, where the desert stretched flat and endless in every direction. Inside, the vinyl booths cracked when you sat down. The jukebox only played 3 songs, and the waitress never smiled. Not once. Not ever. Her name was Claire Donovan, though most folks just called her the Waitress, or sometimes Ice Queen when they thought she couldn't hear. She was 31 years old, thin as a rail, with dark hair pulled back so tight it seemed to hurt. Her uniform was always spotless, powder blue with a white apron, and her movements were precise, mechanical, like someone going through motions they'd practiced 10,000 times. She took orders without meeting eyes. She delivered plates without small talk. She cleared tables in silence. The regulars made it a game. "Bet you a 20 I can get her to crack," truckers would say, launching into their best jokes, their most charming stories. She'd stand there, order pad in hand, face blank as a mannequin. When they finished, she'd simply ask, "Anything else?" in that flat, empty voice that made grown men uncomfortable. The locals had theories. Some said she was heartbroken, waiting for a man who'd never come back. Others whispered she was just cold, maybe even touched in the head. A few swore she was hiding from something. An ex-husband, the law, a past too dark to speak about. Nobody knew the truth. Nobody asked the right questions. The diner's owner, a weathered man named Frank Holloway, had hired Claire 3 years earlier when she'd walked in off the highway with nothing but a canvas bag and desperation in her eyes. He'd needed help, and she'd worked harder than anyone he'd ever seen. So he didn't push, didn't pry. In the desert, people understood that some stories were meant to stay buried. But on the morning of August 19th, 1980, something shifted. A black sedan pulled into the gravel lot just after 7 a.m., its government plates catching the early sun. 2 men in suits stepped out, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the sun barely cresting the mountains. They took a booth by the window. They ordered coffee. And when Claire approached with the pot, one of them looked up at her with an expression that made Frank, watching from behind the counter, go cold. Recognition. Before we go further, comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now. And if this story is already pulling you in, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't believe where this goes. Claire's hand trembled as she poured. Just a fraction, just enough that a few drops hit the saucer. The man in the suit watched those drops spread like they were the most important thing in the world. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice careful, measured. She walked away without a word, but Frank saw what the customers didn't. Her other hand, pressed against her apron, was shaking so badly she had to grip the fabric to steady it. The men stayed for an hour, drinking coffee and picking at pie they never finished. They spoke in low voices, glancing at Claire every few minutes. When they finally left, they placed exact change on the table. No tip, and one of them paused at the door, looking back at her with something that might have been guilt or might have been warning. After they drove away, Claire stood at the window, staring at the empty highway. "You all right?" Frank asked. She didn't answer, didn't move. And when she finally turned around, her face was even more closed than before, if that were possible. But Frank had seen something in those 30 seconds she'd stood at the window. She'd been crying, not sobbing, not making a sound, just tears running down her cheeks, while her expression remained completely, terribly still. That night, after the diner closed, Frank found Claire sitting in the back booth, still in her uniform, staring at her hands. He sat across from her with 2 cups of coffee he'd made fresh. "Been 3 years you've worked here," he said quietly. Never asked why. "But those men today, government men, they knew you." Claire's fingers wrapped around the coffee cup. For a long moment, Frank thought she wouldn't speak. Then her voice came out rough, unused to forming these particular words. "September 9th, 1977, Sunny Meadows subdivision, 14 miles north of here." She looked up, and her eyes were hollow, ancient. "You remember what happened?" Frank's blood turned to ice. Everyone in Nevada remembered. 19 families, 63 people. An entire neighborhood built on land. The government swore was clean, safe, perfect for young families looking for affordable housing in the desert boom. Except it wasn't clean. It was contaminated. Radioactive waste buried shallow, seeping into groundwater, into soil, into the foundations of homes where children played in sprinkler systems and ate vegetables from backyard gardens. By the time anyone noticed, by the time the cancers and the stillbirths and the seizures added up to a pattern someone couldn't ignore, it was too late. The official story: tragic accident, immediate evacuation, full compensation for affected families. The real story: covered up, buried under paperwork and legal threats and hush money paid to the few survivors who knew enough to be dangerous. "My husband worked construction," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Built half those houses. Didn't know what was in the ground. Nobody told them." Her hands tightened on the cup. "My daughter was 6. My son was 4. They loved that backyard, the swing set, the little plastic pool." The coffee pot hissed behind the counter, cutting through the silence. "They died?" Frank asked, though he already knew. 20 months after we moved in. Leukemia. Both of them, 6 weeks apart. Her voice cracked, just slightly. "My husband held on another year. Thyroid cancer spread to his lungs. I watched him waste away to nothing, begging doctors who goddamn knew what had caused it, and they just kept writing prescriptions and avoiding my eyes." Jesus, Claire. I was the only one who didn't get sick. Lucky me. The bitterness in those words could have stripped paint. "So I buried my family, signed their paperwork, took their money, and tried to disappear. Those men today were reminding me that disappeared people don't talk." Frank felt something dark and terrible settle in his chest. "How many others were there? Survivors?" 17, last I heard. Scattered across 3 states, all of us paid to forget. In the distance, a semi-truck's horn echoed across the desert, lonely and fading. Claire stood up, smoothing her apron with those same mechanical movements Frank had watched for 3 years. "You asked why I don't smile," she said. "Now you know." But what Frank didn't know, what nobody in that diner could have known, was that one of those government men would return. And when he did, everything Claire had buried would come screaming back to the surface. The morning shift at the Silver Spur had its own rhythm. Construction workers at 5:30, truckers rolling in by 6. The breakfast rush peaking around 7:15 when the sun turned the highway into a ribbon of liquid chrome. Claire moved through it like a ghost, refilling cups without being asked, delivering orders with that same blank efficiency that had become her armor. Frank watched her more carefully now, seeing things he'd missed before, how she flinched when someone laughed too loud, how her hand would drift to her left wrist where a watch should have been, how she never, ever looked out the western windows toward the mountains where Sunny Meadows used to be. 3 days after the government men's visit, a new regular appeared. His name was Daniel Marsh, though he introduced himself simply as Dan when he took the corner booth on Thursday morning. Mid-40s, graying at the temples, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested too many nights sleeping poorly. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt, dressed like someone who worked in an office but had stopped caring about the details. Collar slightly wrinkled, shoes scuffed at the toes. He ordered coffee and eggs. Claire brought them without comment. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, turning away. "Beautiful morning," he tried. Nothing. Most customers gave up after the first attempt. Dan kept coming back. Every morning, same booth, same order. And every morning he'd try one polite comment. Never pushy, never crude like the truckers who treated her silence as a challenge to overcome. Just simple human acknowledgement. "Coffee's good today. Looks like rain coming. That pie smells incredible." Claire's responses never varied. A nod, sometimes not even that. But she started pouring his coffee before he sat down. Started bringing extra cream without him asking. Small things. Automatic things. The kind of service she gave everyone. Except Frank noticed that when Dan spoke to her, Claire's shoulders would tense just slightly, like someone bracing for impact. On the 8th day, Dan brought a newspaper. He sat reading it while he ate, and when Claire came to refill his coffee, he glanced up. "Says here they're finally cleaning up that old subdivision north of town. Sunny Meadows. You hear about that?" Claire's hand stopped mid-pour. The coffee kept coming, overflowing the cup, spilling across the table in a brown river that spread toward Dan's newspaper. She stared at it, frozen, while the hot liquid dripped onto the vinyl seat. "Whoa, hey!" Dan grabbed napkins, mopping it up quickly. "No harm done, totally my fault for distracting you." But Claire was already backing away, her face paper white. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the first words she'd spoken to a customer in 3 years, and fled toward the kitchen. Frank intercepted Dan before he could follow. "Leave her be. I didn't mean to upset her, You mentioned Sunny Meadows." Frank's voice was flat, hard. "That's not a conversation anyone has around her. Understand?" Dan's face shifted through several expressions. Confusion, realization, something darker. "She lived there? That's her business, not yours. I'm not trying to cause trouble, Dan stopped himself, looking toward the kitchen door where Claire had disappeared. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, strained. "I'm just trying to understand something." The way he said it made Frank pause. There was weight there, guilt maybe, or grief. The kind of tone people use when they're carrying something too heavy to hold alone. "Understand what?" Dan folded his newspaper slowly, carefully, like he was buying time to choose his words. "I work for the Department of Energy, Risk Assessment Division. Have for 18 years. Frank felt ice slide down his spine. "Don't work on active sites anymore," Dan continued. "Mostly consulting now, reviewing old projects for," he laughed, bitter and sharp, "for liability purposes. Making sure the paperwork lines up. Making sure nobody asks the wrong questions about things that happened before anyone was looking too close." "You should leave," Frank said quietly. "Probably. But I've been driving past this diner for 6 months, and 6 months ago is when they assigned me to review the Sunny Meadows file. Dan's hands were shaking now, barely noticeable, but Frank saw. I've read every page, every report, every internal memo that was never meant to see daylight. And I keep coming back here because... He stopped, swallowed hard. Because why? Because I need to know if she's real, if any of them are real. Dan's voice cracked. The file says 17 survivors received compensation and signed non-disclosure agreements. But there are no names, no addresses, nothing that proves they existed as more than line items in a settlement budget. And I need... His breath came uneven. I need to know that what I've been helping cover up actually hurt someone. The air conditioning kicked on, rattling in its housing. Frank sat down across from Dan, his big hands flat on the table. Why? Because I have a daughter. Dan's eyes were wet now, red-rimmed. She's 7. And last month they assigned me a new file. Another housing development. Different state, same goddamn problem. Contaminated land that someone signed off on as safe. And they want me to review the risk assessment. Make sure the language protects the department. Minimize exposure. Exposure to lawsuits. Exposure to truth. Dan wiped his eyes roughly. I've been doing this job for almost 2 decades. I've reviewed 43 cases of environmental contamination. I've helped bury 43 stories about people who got sick because someone in a government office stamped a form without checking, or checked and didn't care, or cared but got overruled by someone who cared more about budgets than bodies. And now you've got a conscience. The cruelty in Frank's voice was intentional, deserved, but Dan didn't flinch from it. Now I can't sleep. Can't look at my daughter without seeing the faces in those files. The few that had faces. Autopsy photos mostly. Children. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. So many children. In the kitchen, pots clanged. The dishwasher ran. Normal sounds of a normal morning in a place where nothing was normal anymore. Claire lost her whole family, Frank said. Husband, son, daughter. Watched them die slow while people like you made sure nobody could sue, nobody could talk, nobody could make it mean anything. I know. Dan's face was gray. I've read her file. What's left of it? Most of it's redacted, but there's enough. The dates, the hospital records, the settlement amount. He looked up, and his eyes held something desperate. Is she okay? I know that's a stupid question, but no, she's not okay. She'll never be okay. Does she know? About the others? About what really happened? Frank thought about Claire standing at the window, crying silent tears. About the way she'd lived 3 years in a town where nobody knew her name, serving coffee to strangers, going through motions because the alternative was stopping. And stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. She knows enough, Frank said. More than enough. Dan nodded slowly. Then he pulled out his wallet, placed 2 20s on the table, 5 times what his meal cost, and stood up. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her... He stopped. Tell her that someone knows what happened. That it wasn't her fault. That it wasn't any of their faults. He was almost to the door when Frank called after him. What are you going to do? About that new file? Dan turned, back, and for the first time, there was something like steel in his expression. I'm going to make sure at least one person tells the truth. After he left, Frank found Claire in the dry storage room, sitting on a crate of canned tomatoes, her arms wrapped around herself. He's gone, Frank said. He knew, Claire whispered. He knew what happened. He knew about... Her breath hitched. About my babies. He's one of them, government man. But I think... Frank sat down on another crate. I think maybe he's trying to make something right. Nothing makes this right. Nothing. They sat in silence, surrounded by industrial-sized cans and bulk flour, while outside the breakfast rush continued without them. Eventually, Claire stood up, smoothed her apron, and walked back out to the floor. But something had shifted. Something had cracked open, and Daniel Marsh would return, though not in the way anyone expected. Because guilt is a powerful thing, and the truth, once awakened, demands to be spoken. Dan Marsh didn't come back the next day or the day after that. A week passed, then 2. The corner booth stayed empty most mornings, filled occasionally by tourists passing through who never stayed long enough to become familiar. Claire moved through her shifts with that same mechanical precision, but Frank noticed she'd started glancing at the door when it opened, a quick flicker of her eyes before she caught herself and looked away. She was waiting for something, or dreading it. On September 4th, 1980, exactly 3 years and 5 days after Claire's son had died, Dan returned. He looked worse, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and decisions that cost something to make. He carried a manila folder under his arm, thick with papers, and when he sat down in his usual booth, his hands trembled as he placed it on the table. Claire approached with coffee pot in hand, and this time when their eyes met, neither looked away. "I need to talk to you," Dan said quietly. "Not here. Not now. But soon. Please." Claire's throat worked. "Why?" "Because I found something, in the files. Something they missed when they redacted everything." His voice dropped lower. "Something about your husband." The coffee pot nearly slipped from her grip. Frank was there in seconds, taking it from her, guiding her to sit across from Dan. The morning crowd buzzed around them, oblivious, comfortable in their ignorance, while 3 people sat in a booth holding a truth too heavy for the bright desert morning. "What about my husband?" Claire's voice was steel wrapped around broken glass. Dan opened the folder carefully, like it might explode. Inside were photocopies, some so heavily marked with black redaction bars they were barely readable. But one page, near the bottom, had been overlooked. An internal memo dated June 15, 1977. 3 months before the first families moved into Sunny Meadows. Dan turned it so Claire could read. RA, soil contamination levels, Sunny Meadows development testing indicates radioactive isotopes present at 3.7x acceptable exposure limits. Recommend additional remediation before construction proceeds. Estimated cost, 2.3 m. Estimated delay, 8 to 12 months. Decision, proceed as scheduled. Risk assessment team concurs exposure levels pose minimal long-term health risk. Legal has reviewed disclosure requirements and confirms no obligation to inform residents or construction workers of contamination. Cost-benefit analysis attached. Approved by J. Whitmore, Regional Director, countersigned by D. Marsh, Risk Assessment. The last line hit like a physical blow. Claire's eyes tracked across the page once, twice, 3 times, as if reading it again might change the words. When she finally looked up at Dan, her face had gone beyond pale into something translucent, ghost-like. "You signed it," she whispered. "You knew. You knew it was poisoned ground, and you signed the paper that let them build anyway." Dan's face crumpled. Tears spilled down his cheeks unchecked. "I was 28 years old, new to the department. My supervisor told me the numbers were acceptable, that the risk was minimal, that this was standard procedure. I trusted him. I trusted the system." His voice broke. "I didn't ask questions. I just signed." "My husband," Claire's hands were fists on the table. My husband dug foundations on that land. His crew poured concrete, installed pipes, breathed dust from contaminated soil every day for 6 months. And you knew. I didn't know what it would mean. Dan's hands covered his face. I see them every night now. Your children, your husband, all 63 people. I see them, and I know that my signature on that paper is why they're dead. The dishwasher in the kitchen went silent. The jukebox between songs created a pocket of terrible quiet. In that silence, Frank watched Claire's face cycle through expressions he'd never seen her make. Rage, grief, something darker that might have been the desire to reach across the table and hurt this man who'd hurt her so profoundly without ever knowing her name. But what came out was worse than violence. "Do you have children?" she asked, her voice flat. "A daughter, 7 years old. What's her name?" Dan hesitated, some instinct warning him where this was going. "Emma." "Emma." Claire repeated it like she was tasting poison. "When Emma was 4, did she like to play in the sprinkler? Did she dig in the dirt? Did she eat strawberries you grew in your backyard? Please." My daughter's name was Sophie. She was 6 when she died, 6 years old, and by the end she weighed 42 pounds because the cancer ate everything inside her. She cried every night because her bones hurt, because her hair fell out, because she didn't understand why her body was betraying her. Claire's voice never rose, never broke, just kept coming like a blade. "My son was Michael. He was 4. He loved trucks. He had this little red dump truck he carried everywhere, and when he got too weak to play, he'd just hold it in his bed, making truck noises until he couldn't anymore." Dan was sobbing openly now, shoulders shaking, breath coming in gasps. "My husband was Robert. He was 34. He proposed to me on a beach in California, and he cried when Sophie was born. And he taught Michael how to throw a baseball even though Michael was too small to really catch it yet. He died apologizing to me. Apologizing. Like it was his fault for building those houses, for bringing us there, for not protecting us from something he never knew existed." She leaned forward, and her eyes were dry, burning. "You want absolution? You want me to tell you it wasn't your fault, that you didn't know, that you were just following orders? I can't give you that. I won't." "I know." Dan's voice was wrecked. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm trying to make this right. That new file they gave me, the one I told Frank about, I leaked it. Sent copies to every major newspaper, every environmental group, every senator on the oversight committee. I burned my career, my pension, probably my freedom, but I couldn't sign another paper. I couldn't be responsible for more families like yours." Claire sat back, something shifting in her expression. Not forgiveness. That landscape was too scorched for anything to grow. But maybe recognition. Of pain. Of guilt. Of the weight of living with choices that can't be unmade. "They'll come for you," she said quietly. "Let them come. They'll call you a traitor, bury you in lawsuits, make sure nobody believes a word you say. I know." Outside, a tanker truck pulled into the lot, its air brakes hissing like a sigh. Frank had been silent through all of this, witnessing something too raw for interruption. But now he spoke, his voice gentle. "Claire, what do you want to do?" She looked at the memo still lying on the table between them, at Dan's signature barely visible on the photocopy, at this broken man who'd carried his guilt across months and miles to lay it at her feet. "I want them all to know," she said finally. "Everyone who signed papers, everyone who approved budgets, Everyone who decided that money mattered more than children's lives. I want their names public. I want their families to know what they did." Dan nodded, reaching into his folder. "I have 17 other memos, 12 more signatures, including the regional director who approved the whole project, James Whitmore. He's running for state senate now. His campaign is about family values and government accountability." Something almost like a smile touched Claire's lips, sharp and cold. Not anymore, he's not. The alliance formed in that booth was unlikely, fragile, built on the ruins of lives that could never be restored. But it was real, and it was dangerous. Because when the powerful are threatened, they don't just defend themselves. They destroy. And neither Claire nor Dan understood yet how far the cover-up reached, or how many people would fight to keep Sunny Meadows buried in the past where it belonged. The next morning, both of them would receive visits that would test every ounce of courage they'd found. But in that moment, sitting in the Silver Spur diner while ordinary life continued around them, they had something neither had possessed in years. Purpose. The black sedan arrived at Claire's apartment at 6:17 in the morning, just as the first light broke over the eastern hills. She was already awake. She was always awake. Had been since 1977, when sleep became something that brought only nightmares. Making coffee in the tiny kitchenette of the efficiency unit she rented above the hardware store. Through the thin curtains, she saw the car pull up, saw the two men in suits step out, and recognized them immediately. The same men who'd visited the diner 3 weeks ago. Her hands stayed steady as she poured her coffee. She'd been expecting this. One of them knocked. Firm, professional, the kind of knock that said we're being polite, but we don't have to be. Claire opened the door before the second knock, standing in the threshold in her waitress uniform already pressed and ready, meeting their eyes with the same blank expression she'd perfected over 3 years. "Miss Donovan," the taller one said. His badge read, "Agent Reeves, Department of Energy. May we come in?" "No." The word hung there, simple and absolute. Reeves smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We have some concerns about recent activity that involves you. It would be better to discuss this privately." Then discuss it. The second agent, younger with wire-rimmed glasses, shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Donovan, we understand you've been in contact with Daniel Marsh, former employee of the DOE, currently under investigation for theft of classified documents and violation of federal non-disclosure statutes. I serve him coffee. I serve a lot of people coffee." "He showed you classified materials," Reeves said, his voice hardening. "Materials that you, as a signatory to a binding non-disclosure agreement, are legally prohibited from viewing or discussing. That makes you complicit in his crimes." Claire sipped her coffee, letting the silence stretch. 3 years of not speaking had taught her the power of withholding words. Finally, "Are you arresting me?" "Not yet. We're offering you an opportunity to correct this situation before it escalates." Reeves pulled a document from his jacket. "Sign this revised non-disclosure agreement. Confirm that you will not discuss, share, or act upon any information provided by Mr. Marsh, and this all goes away. And if I don't, then we'll be forced to pursue criminal charges. Conspiracy to expose classified information, violation of federal statutes, possibly even terrorism, depending on how the attorneys want to frame your intent." His smile was cold now, reptilian. "You'd be looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison. Minimum." The younger agent looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. "Ma'am, we know what happened to your family. We know this is difficult. But the agreement you signed was legally binding. The settlement you received was contingent on your silence. Breaking that agreement doesn't just hurt you. It invalidates the entire compensation structure. The other 16 survivors could lose everything they were paid. There it was, the real threat. Not just her freedom, but the knowledge that speaking out would hurt the only other people who'd survived Sunny Meadows, who'd lost everything like she had, who'd taken the money because what else was there? Claire looked past them to the street below, where ordinary people were beginning their ordinary days. She thought about Sophie and Michael, about Robert, about the way his hand had felt in hers as he died, apologizing for sins that weren't his. "I'll think about it," she said. "You have 48 hours," Reeves said, tucking the document into her mailbox. "After that, we move forward with prosecution. For your sake and for the other survivors, make the right choice." They left. The black sedan pulled away, and Claire stood in her doorway, coffee going cold in her hand, while the weight of 17 other lives pressed down on her shoulders. She'd wanted justice. She'd wanted their names exposed, their crimes made public. But not at the cost of destroying the only other people who understood what she'd lost. 20 miles away, Dan Marsh was having a similar morning. His supervisor, a man named Gerald Hendricks, who'd worked in the DOE for 34 years, sat across from Dan in a conference room that smelled of industrial cleaner and something sour underneath. The building was empty this early, just the two of them and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. "You've put us in an impossible position," Hendricks said. His voice was tired, disappointed, like a father addressing a wayward son. 18 years of good work, a spotless record. And you threw it away for what? A crisis of conscience? Dan's hands were folded on the table, steady now that the decision was made. "I leaked documentation of criminal negligence that led to 63 deaths. If that's throwing away my career, I'll live with it. You leaked classified materials. You violated federal law. Do you understand what that means? Not just for you, but for everyone who works in this department?" Hendricks leaned forward. "Every risk assessment we've ever signed off on will now be questioned. Every project we've cleared will be scrutinized by lawyers looking for liability. You've opened the door to decades of lawsuits that could cripple our ability to function. Maybe you should be questioned. Maybe every signature on every document that puts profits over people should be scrutinized." Hendricks's face hardened. "You're going to talk about morality. You signed that memo, Dan. Your name is on the Sunny Meadows approval right next to mine. If you're willing to destroy yourself for your guilty conscience, fine. But don't pretend you're some crusader for justice when your hands are just as dirty as anyone's." The words landed like punches, because they were true. "I know what I did," Dan said quietly. "I'm not trying to erase it. I'm trying to stop it from happening again." Noble, pointless. Hendricks stood up, buttoning his jacket. "The new development file you leaked? The contamination you're so worried about? It's already been cleared by 3 independent environmental assessments. The levels are within acceptable limits. You created panic over nothing, damaged our credibility, and for what? So you can feel better about a mistake you made a decade ago? 1977 wasn't a decade ago. It was 3 years. And the mistake wasn't in the numbers. It was in thinking numbers could capture what it means to bury children who died because we decided acceptable risk was worth more than their lives." Hendricks paused at the door. "You have a daughter, don't you? Emma?" Ice shot through Dan's veins. "Don't. 7 years old, attends Pinewood Elementary. Your wife works at the county library." Hendricks's voice was casual, conversational. I'm not threatening you. I'm reminding you that actions have consequences. You've made powerful people very nervous, Dan. And when powerful people get nervous, they protect themselves. Sometimes that protection extends to making sure their critics lose credibility. Personal credibility. Family credibility. If you touch my family, I won't touch anyone, but I can't speak for everyone. There are people above my pay grade who are very interested in containing this situation. My advice? Recant your allegations. Claim you were suffering from stress, mental health issues, substance abuse, something that explains your erratic behavior without actually implicating the department in wrongdoing. Do that, and I can probably keep you out of prison, keep your pension, maybe even your family intact. The threat was clear, even wrapped in reasonable concern. Hendricks left. The conference room door clicked shut, and Dan sat alone in the fluorescent buzz, thinking about Emma's laugh, about his wife's face, about the 17 people whose names he didn't know, but whose lives he'd already put at risk. The leaked documents had been out for 5 days. So far, only 2 newspapers had picked up the story, small regional outlets that buried it in back sections. The major networks stayed silent. Senators' offices sent form letter responses. The environmental groups thanked him for his concern and said they'd look into it. Nothing was happening. Nothing was changing. And now he had to choose between his family's safety and the slim hope that exposing the truth would matter. That evening, Claire and Dan met in the parking lot behind an abandoned gas station, 15 miles outside of town. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of rust and blood. Neither had called the other. They'd both simply known that after the visits, after the threats, they needed to see each other's faces. "They came for you too," Claire said. It wasn't a question. "Threatened my daughter. Threatened the other survivors. They stood in the dying light, 2 people who'd lost everything trying to decide if they were willing to lose even more." "We could stop," Dan said quietly. "Sign their papers. Go back to pretending this never happened." "Could you? Really?" Dan thought about Emma. Then he thought about the memo with his signature. About 63 people who never got a choice. About the next family who'd move into contaminated housing because someone decided the numbers were acceptable. "No," he admitted. "I couldn't." Claire nodded. "Then we keep going. But we do it smart. We find the other survivors, get their stories, make this so big they can't bury it. And if they come after your people, the other 16, then we make sure their stories get told too. All of them. So their suffering means something." The last light faded from the sky. In the distance, headlights moved along the highway. People going home, going about their lives, safely ignorant of the poisoned ground they drove over. "We're going to lose," Dan said. "You know that, right? They have money, power, the entire system protecting them. We have some documents and our word against theirs." "Probably," Claire agreed. "But at least we'll lose fighting." They would learn in the coming days just how true that was. Because the powerful don't just have money and lawyers, they have reach. Finding the other survivors wasn't as simple as Claire had hoped. The settlement agreements had been designed specifically to scatter them, to ensure that the 17 people who'd walked out of Sunny Meadows alive would never form a collective voice. No contact information was shared. No support groups formed, just individual checks deposited into individual accounts, and signatures on papers that promised silence in exchange for survival. But Claire remembered some names. Faces from the neighborhood before everything fell apart. The Kowalski family who'd lived 2 houses down. Their teenage daughter had survived, though both parents died. The Martinez couple who'd lost their son but lived themselves. The elderly widower, Mr. Chen, whose wife succumbed to thyroid cancer within a year. Dan used his remaining access to DOE databases, access they hadn't revoked yet, a mistake that would cost them, to cross-reference names with settlement payments. It took 3 days of careful searching, always from different computers, always covering his tracks. They found 8 names, 8 people still alive out of the original 17. 5 had disconnected phones. 2 had moved without forwarding addresses. But one, Teresa Kowalski, now Teresa Manning, answered on the 3rd ring. Claire made the call from a payphone outside a truck stop, her hands shaking as she dialed. Hello? The voice was older than Claire remembered, roughened by years and cigarettes but still recognizable. Teresa, this is Claire Donovan from Sunny Meadows. Silence. Then, how did you get this number? I need to talk to you about what happened. About... No. The word was sharp, frightened. I signed papers. We all signed papers. You can't call me about this. Teresa, they threatened me. They're threatening anyone who tries to speak up. But there's a man who's helping, someone from inside the department who has proof. I don't care. I don't care about proof or justice or any of it. Teresa's voice cracked. I was 19 years old when my parents died. 19. I watched my mother waste away to 70 pounds. I held my father's hand while he drowned in his own fluids because the cancer filled his lungs. And you know what I got for it? $83,000 and a piece of paper that said I could never talk about it again. That's not enough. That's not... It's what kept me alive. It's what let me move away, start over, pretend I came from somewhere else. I have a husband now. 2 kids who don't know anything about Sunny Meadows. And I will not let you drag me back into that hell because you think some government man's guilty conscience is going to change anything. People are still dying, Teresa. There's another development, contaminated ground. Families moving in. Then they'll get their settlements too. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. A bitter laugh. You think you're going to save them? You think exposing this will change anything except ruining what's left of our lives? The line went dead. Claire stood holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone, feeling the first real crack in her resolve. What if Teresa was right? What if all this accomplished was destroying the fragile peace the other survivors had built? Dan had better luck, though better was relative. Marcus Chen, 71 years old, living in a retirement community in Arizona, agreed to meet. He was the only survivor over 65. His wife had died in Sunny Meadows, but he'd been healthy enough, or lucky enough, to outlive the contamination. They met in a park near his facility, Dan and Claire sitting on a bench while Marcus fed breadcrumbs to pigeons with trembling hands. I wondered when someone would come, he said in accented English, his voice papery and thin. Wondered if I'd live long enough to see it. You'll help us? Claire asked, hope rising. Help? Marcus scattered more crumbs. What help can I give? I'm an old man who signed papers I couldn't read properly. They gave me a translator, but I think now maybe he translated what they wanted me to hear, not what the papers actually said. You could testify. Tell your story. Help us prove the pattern of negligence. Marcus was quiet for a long time, watching the pigeons squabble over bread. My wife's name was Lynn. We came to America in 1962. We saved for 15 years to buy that house. It was supposed to be our dream. His hands stilled. She died thinking she'd failed somehow, that she'd gotten sick because she wasn't strong enough, wasn't American enough, wasn't good enough. She apologized to me. Can you imagine? Apologizing for dying from poison they put in our ground. I'm sorry, Claire whispered. Everyone is sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back. Marcus turned to face them and his eyes were ancient, tired. But yes, I'll help. Not because I think it will change anything, but because Lynn deserves to have her name spoken. They took her life. They won't take her memory, too. One survivor, one voice. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The response came faster than either expected. 2 days after Claire's call to Teresa, a local news station ran a story. Former Nevada resident charged with stalking and harassment. The piece detailed how Claire Donovan, a diner waitress with a history of mental instability, had been contacting former residents of a closed housing development, making wild accusations about government conspiracies and demanding money for fabricated claims. Teresa had gone to the authorities, or been coached to. The article included a photo, Claire's old driver's license picture from 1976, back when she still smiled, and quoted anonymous sources about her obsessive behavior and disconnection from reality. Frank showed her the paper when she arrived for her shift. They're destroying you, he said quietly, making sure nobody will believe anything you say. Claire read the article twice, her hands steady even as her insides turned to ice. This was how they did it. Not with direct threats, but with systematic dismantling of credibility. Make the victim look unstable. Make the story sound like delusion. Make anyone who speaks up seem dangerous or crazy or both. They're smart, she said. I'll give them that. Claire. What would you do, Frank? She looked up at him, really looked, seeing him clearly maybe for the first time. This man who'd given her a job without questions, who'd let her work in silence for 3 years, who'd sat with her while she confessed her grief. If you were me, if you'd lost everything, would you stop? Frank thought about his own daughter, grown now and living in California, safe from all of this. About the choices people make when the system is rigged against them. About the difference between survival and living. No, he admitted. I don't think I could. Then I keep going. But that night, alone in her apartment, Claire allowed herself one moment of doubt. She pulled out the revised non-disclosure agreement that Agent Reeves had left, read through its language. All she had to do was sign, confirm her silence, go back to serving coffee and pretending the past didn't exist. 17 other survivors would keep their money, keep their peace, keep living whatever lives they'd managed to build on top of their grief. Her signature could protect them, or her voice could maybe, possibly, prevent another family from experiencing what they'd experienced. Sophie's photo sat on the small table beside her bed. 6 years old, gap-toothed smile, holding that ridiculous stuffed elephant she'd named Mr. Trunks. In the picture, she was healthy, happy, alive. Claire picked up a pen. She held it over the signature line, and then she set it down and picked up the phone instead. Dan? It's me. I found another name. Sarah Martinez. Lives in Portland now, and I'm not stopping. I don't care what they do to me. We're finishing this. On the other end of the line, Dan Marsh, who'd been sitting in his own darkness, holding his own pen over his own surrender, felt something break and reshape inside him. I'm with you, he said, whatever it takes. Neither of them knew that Agent Reeves was already on a plane to Portland, that the net was tightening, that the powerful, when threatened, become most dangerous just before they're exposed. The end game was beginning. Sarah Martinez opened her door in Portland at 8:15 on a Tuesday evening, expecting a package delivery. Instead, she found Claire Donovan standing in the rain. "I know you don't want to see me," Claire said before Sarah could speak. "I know this is the last thing you need, but please, 5 minutes." Sarah was 42 now, 16 years older than when Sunny Meadows had taken her son. She'd rebuilt, remarried, had 2 more children, worked as a dental hygienist, lived in a neighborhood where people knew nothing about Nevada or contaminated ground or the way cancer could steal a 4-year-old's laughter. "How did you find me?" Sarah's voice was tight, controlled. "Someone who's trying to help. Someone who wants to make sure this never happens again." It's happening again. The question came out before Sarah could stop it, and in that moment Claire saw the crack in her armor, the mother's terror that never fully heals. Different state, different families, same negligence. Claire held up the folder Dan had given her, rain-spotted but intact. "They're doing it again, Sarah, and they'll keep doing it unless someone makes them stop." Sarah looked past Claire to the quiet street. The normal houses with their normal families living normal lives, built on the assumption that the government wouldn't poison them for profit. Her hands gripped the doorframe. "Come in," she said finally. "But my husband doesn't know. My children don't know. And if you try to drag them into this, I won't. I promise." Inside, Sarah's home was everything Claire's apartment wasn't. Warm, lived in, full of the comfortable chaos of family life. Children's drawings on the refrigerator, photos on the mantle, a life carefully constructed on top of a past that couldn't be acknowledged. They sat at the kitchen table while Sarah poured coffee with shaking hands. "His name was David," Sarah said quietly. "My first son. He loved dinosaurs. Had them all memorized. The names, what they ate, everything. He could tell you the difference between a brachiosaurus and a brontosaurus when he was 3 years old." Her voice caught. By the time he was 4, he couldn't remember his own name. The tumors in his brain. She stopped, breathed, continued. "They told me it was random. Bad luck. 1 in a million. And I believed them because what else could I do? Then the other families started getting sick, and I knew. I knew it wasn't random. But by then, I'd already signed the papers, taken the money, and my first husband, David's father, he couldn't handle it. Left 6 months after David died. Said I should have known somehow. Should have protected our son. Sarah, I don't want your pity. I don't want anything except to never think about Sunny Meadows again." Sarah met Claire's eyes. "But you're telling me there are children right now, living on poisoned ground, and their parents don't know." 67 families in the new development, mostly young couples, first-time homebuyers who got a deal that seemed too good to be true. Claire opened the folder, showing Sarah the documents Dan had leaked. Same pattern, same contamination levels, same risk assessments signed off by people who know better. Sarah read through the papers, her hands steadier now, the dental hygienist's precision evident in how she absorbed information. When she finished, she looked up with something hard and sharp in her expression. "What do you need from me?" "Your story, on record. Marcus Chen is already willing to testify. If we can get 3 survivors, we can establish a pattern. Make this too big to bury. And if they come after me? After my family? They already are. They're coming after all of us. The question is whether we let them do it in silence or if we make enough noise that people have to listen." From upstairs, a child's voice called, "Mom, can you help me with my homework?" Sarah closed her eyes. I'll think about it. That's all I can promise. But Claire saw the decision already forming. Saw it in the way Sarah's jaw set, in the protective fury that only mothers understand. The knowledge that their children are safe only because other children might not be, and the terrible burden of that arithmetic. Dan Marsh was having his own crisis 2 states away. His wife, Jennifer, had found the folder he'd hidden in his office. Not the leaked documents, those were safely distributed, but his personal notes. Names, dates. The memo with his signature that he looked at every night like penance. You signed this? Jennifer stood in their bedroom doorway, her face pale. You approved contaminated land? Dan, people died? I know. He couldn't meet her eyes. I've known for 6 months. It's why I leaked the files. Why I've been destroying our lives? Her voice cracked. You could go to prison. We could lose everything. Emma could. She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. They called me today, from your office, asked if you'd been acting strangely, suggested I watch for signs of instability. They're building a case that you're mentally unfit, Dan. They're going to take you away from us. I had to do something. I couldn't just. You could have told me. You could have let me help you figure this out instead of going on some solo crusade that's going to destroy our family. Jennifer sat on the bed, tears streaming. I love you. I believe you did what you thought was right. But Emma needs her father, and I need my husband. And if you go to prison or lose your mind or get yourself killed trying to fix something you can't fix, what happens to us? The question hung between them, unanswerable. From down the hall, Emma called out, Daddy, can you read me a story? Dan looked at his wife, then at the folder, then toward his daughter's room where innocence still existed, where bedtime stories and goodnight kisses were the extent of life's complications. What would you do? He asked Jennifer. If it were you, if your signature had killed 63 people, including children Emma's age, what would you do? Jennifer was quiet for a long time. Finally, I'd want to make it right, but not at the cost of my own child's welfare. There has to be another way, Dan. Some way that doesn't require you to sacrifice everything. I don't think there is. Then we find one. Together. She took his hand. But you don't do this alone anymore. And you don't make decisions that affect our family without talking to me first. Understood? Dan nodded, something loosening in his chest. He'd been carrying this alone for so long, the weight had become almost comfortable in its familiarity. Having someone else hold part of it felt strange, frightening, but also like oxygen after drowning. There's a woman, he said. Claire Donovan. She lost everyone in Sunny Meadows. She's trying to find other survivors, get them to testify. If we can build a coalition, then you'll have witnesses, corroboration, a case instead of just accusations. Jennifer's mind was working now, practical and sharp. What do you need? Legal help. Someone who can navigate this without getting us all arrested. My sister's husband is an attorney. Civil rights cases. He might know someone. It wasn't much, but it was something. A foundation to build on. 3 days later, Claire, Dan, Sarah, and Marcus met in a small office in Reno with an attorney named Patricia Torres. No relation to the Patricia who'd betrayed Claire. A coincidence that felt almost cruel. Torres was in her 50s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, with a reputation for taking cases no one else would touch. She listened to their stories without interruption, read through Dan's documents with increasing fury, made notes in precise handwriting that filled 6 legal pages. When they finished, She sat back in her chair. "They're going to destroy you," she said flatly. "All of you. They have the resources, the legal teams, the political connections. This kind of case, federal negligence, corporate liability, cover-ups spanning years. It takes money and time that none of you have. And even if we somehow get to trial, the evidence will be challenged, the witnesses discredited, and you'll be lucky to escape without criminal charges." The silence in the room was crushing. "However," Torres continued, a slight smile touching her lips, "I've spent 30 years making powerful people uncomfortable, and this case pisses me off, so I'll take it. Pro bono. But you need to understand what you're signing up for. This will consume your lives, ruin your reputations, cost you relationships, jobs, peace of mind. The question you each need to answer is, can you live with the consequences of losing? Because we probably will lose." Claire thought about Sophie and Michael, about 3 years of silence, about the alternative, going back to pretending none of it mattered. "I can live with losing," she said. "I can't live with not trying." Sarah nodded. "I have 2 children who are alive because I got lucky. The families in that new development deserve the same chance." Marcus simply said, "Lynn would want me to fight." Dan looked at the memo with his signature, then at the faces around him. People bound together by grief and guilt, and the stubborn refusal to let evil win through silence. "Let's finish this," he said. Torres pulled out contracts. "Then let's make some powerful people very, very nervous." Outside, storm clouds gathered over Reno. The first drops of rain began to fall, and in Washington, D.C., in offices with no names on the doors, phones started ringing with urgent calls about 4 people in Nevada who'd just become a problem that needed solving. The machinery of power began to turn, but so did the machinery of truth. The lawsuit was filed on October 9th, 1980, exactly 3 years and 30 days after Claire's daughter, Sophie, had died. Donovan et al. v. United States Department of Energy landed like a bomb in federal court. 147 pages of documented negligence, survivor testimony, and leaked internal memos that painted a portrait of systematic disregard for human life, spanning multiple administrations and multiple sites. The response was immediate and vicious. Within 24 hours, the Department of Justice filed motions to dismiss on grounds of national security. Within 48 hours, Claire's landlord received an anonymous complaint about illegal activity in her apartment, leading to an eviction notice. Within 72 hours, Dan's wife Jennifer was pulled over 3 times in 2 days for minor traffic violations that seemed coordinated to harass. But Patricia Torres had anticipated this. She'd already sent copies of every document to 17 news outlets, 6 environmental organizations, and 12 senators on oversight committees. She'd prepared affidavits from all 4 plaintiffs and recorded video depositions in case any of them were suddenly unavailable. She'd built redundancy into every aspect of the case. "They can't make us all disappear," she told Claire over coffee in her office. "That's our only advantage. Sunlight." The first major newspaper to run the story was the Las Vegas Sun, with a front-page article titled, "Government Documents Reveal Decades of Contamination Cover-Ups." The piece included photos, Marcus Chen holding a picture of his wife Lynn, Sarah Martinez standing outside the house where her son had died, and Claire, finally, allowing her face to be shown alongside her story. The photo showed her in her waitress uniform, standing outside the Silver Spur diner. The caption read, "Claire Donovan, survivor, who spent 3 years in silence before finding the courage to speak." Frank had taken the picture. He'd closed the diner for the day to drive her to the interview, and afterward, he'd held her while she cried in his truck. The weight of breaking her silence both devastating and freeing in equal measure. "You did good," he'd said simply. Sophie would be proud. The case moved faster than anyone expected. Public pressure mounted, environmental groups rallied. Parents from the new contaminated development, the one Dan had leaked information about, filed their own lawsuit, citing the Donovan case as precedent. Senators called for investigations. The EPA announced emergency testing protocols. And then came the hearing. Federal courtroom, Carson City, November 3, 1980. Judge Margaret Holloway presiding. A woman in her 60s known for her impatience with government stonewalling and her commitment to transparency. Claire sat at the plaintiff's table between Sarah and Marcus, Dan behind them, with Jennifer's hand in his. The gallery was packed. Journalists, activists, other survivors who'd started coming forward once they realized they weren't alone. The government's attorney, a polished man named Crawford, stood to make his opening argument. "Your Honor, these claims, while tragic in their personal nature, represent a fundamental misunderstanding of risk assessment protocols and the complexities of environmental management. The Department of Energy followed all appropriate guidelines." "Mr. Crawford," Judge Holloway interrupted, "I've read the leaked memos. I've seen the signatures. I've reviewed the risk assessments that were ignored in favor of budget considerations. So let's skip the part where you pretend this was about guidelines and get to the part where you explain why your clients decided $83,000 per dead family member was adequate compensation for criminal negligence." The courtroom went silent. Crawford recovered quickly, but the damage was done. Judge Holloway's tone had set the temperature for the entire proceeding. When Patricia Torres called Claire to testify, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Claire walked to the stand in her best dress, a simple navy blue she'd bought specifically for this, the first new clothing she'd purchased in 3 years. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, though the truth was all she had left. Torres began gently. "Ms. Donovan, can you tell the court about your family?" And Claire did. She told them about Robert, about his proposal on the California beach, about the way he'd cried when Sophie was born. She told them about Sophie's gap-toothed smile and her love of elephants, about Michael's red dump truck and his truck noises that filled their home with joy. She told them about the first symptoms, the fatigue they'd dismissed as growing pains, the bruises they'd thought were from playing too rough, the fever that wouldn't break. She told them about hospital rooms and test results, and doctors who knew what was happening, but couldn't say it. Bound by the same non-disclosure agreements that had kept everyone silent. She told them about Sophie's last words. "Mama, am I going to be okay?" And how Claire had lied and said yes. "Yes, baby, you're going to be fine." Even though they both knew the truth. She told them about burying her children 6 weeks apart, about watching her husband waste away while apologizing for failing to protect them from something he'd never known existed. And she told them about the men in suits who'd come to her with paperwork and checks and promises that this would all go away if she just signed and stayed quiet. "Why did you sign?" Torres asked. "Because I had nothing left," Claire said simply. "They were gone. All of them. And the paper said if I didn't sign, I'd get nothing. Not even enough to pay for their funerals. So I signed, and I took the money, and I tried to disappear." What changed? Claire looked at Dan, sitting in the gallery with tears streaming down his face. Someone decided guilt mattered more than convenience. Someone decided that truth was worth the cost. And I realized that staying silent wasn't protecting my family's memory. It was letting their deaths mean nothing. Torres produced the memo. Do you recognize this document? Yes. It's the risk assessment that approved Sunny Meadows for construction. Signed by James Whitmore and Daniel Marsh, both Department of Energy employees. Dated 3 months before my family moved in. And what does this document tell us? That they knew. Everyone knew. And they built the houses anyway. The gallery erupted. Judge Holloway gavelled for order. And Crawford stood to cross-examine. But the best he could do was verify dates and signatures. The facts were undeniable. When Sarah testified, she brought photos of David. When Marcus testified, he spoke in his accented English about Lynn's dreams of America. And when Dan took the stand, called by Torres as a witness, he did something unprecedented. He confessed. I signed that memo, he said, his voice steady despite the tears. I approved contaminated land because my supervisor told me to, and I didn't ask enough questions. I trusted the system, and my signature contributed to 63 deaths, including Sophie and Michael Donovan, David Martinez, and Lynn Chen. I live with that every day, and I leaked those documents because I couldn't live with it happening again. Crawford tried to discredit him. Mr. Marsh, isn't it true you were recently diagnosed with clinical depression? That you've been under significant stress? Yes, because I helped kill children. That tends to cause stress. The honesty was brutal, unspinnable. Judge Holloway recessed for 3 hours. When she returned, her expression was carved from stone. I'm granting a preliminary injunction halting all construction on the new development pending full EPA review. I'm ordering the Department of Energy to unseal all documents related to Sunny Meadows and any similar sites. And I'm scheduling a full trial for January to determine criminal liability and appropriate damages. She looked at the government's table. Gentlemen, I suggest you start preparing for a very public reckoning. The courtroom exploded with applause. Claire sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. They'd won. Not the war. The trial would take months, maybe years. But this battle, this moment. Sarah grabbed her hand. Marcus smiled his quiet smile, and Dan, standing in the gallery, met her eyes and nodded. They'd done it. They'd made the truth matter. That night, Claire stood outside the Silver Spur Diner, looking at the neon sign flickering in the darkness. Frank had kept it lit for her, even though the diner was closed. He came out with 2 cups of coffee, handing her one. Heard it went well, he said. It did. You gonna smile now? Finally? Claire considered the question. Thought about Sophie and Michael, about Robert, about the 3 years she'd spent in silence and the breaking open of the last few months. And she smiled. It hurt. It felt strange, muscles unused to the motion. But it was real. There it is, Frank said softly. Was wondering if I'd ever see it. Me too. They stood in the parking lot, drinking coffee under the Nevada stars, while somewhere in the distance, families slept safely because 4 people had decided that truth was worth fighting for. The road ahead was long. The government would appeal. The trial would be brutal. But tonight, in this moment, Claire Donovan was no longer just surviving. She was living, and her children's names would be remembered. The trial lasted 4 months. Donovan et al. v. United States Department of Energy became the landmark case that reshaped how the federal government handled environmental contamination. Judge Holloway's final ruling, delivered on March 17, 1981, awarded damages totaling $47 million to be distributed among all proven Sunny Meadows survivors and their families. More importantly, It established legal precedent requiring mandatory disclosure of all contamination data to residents and workers, criminal liability for officials who knowingly approved hazardous sites, and independent oversight of all DOE risk assessments. James Whitmore, the regional director who'd approved Sunny Meadows, resigned 2 days before the verdict and was later indicted on federal charges. 3 other senior officials followed. The new contaminated development Dan had exposed was demolished before a single family moved in. The land remediated at government expense. But victory, Claire learned, didn't feel the way she'd imagined. It didn't bring Sophie and Michael back. Didn't erase the hospital rooms or the funerals or the 3 years of silence that had carved hollows in her she'd never fully fill. The money sat in her bank account, untouched. Blood money, even if it came from the right people this time. What changed was smaller, quieter. She started smiling at the diner. Not always, not easily, but sometimes when a regular made a joke or a trucker thanked her for the coffee or Frank did something absurdly kind, like buying flowers for the tables, because he thought they needed brightening. She attended a support group for trauma survivors, sitting in a circle with people whose losses were different, but whose grief felt familiar. She learned that healing wasn't about forgetting or moving on. It was about learning to carry the weight without it crushing you completely. She visited Sophie and Michael's graves every Sunday, bringing flowers and sitting in the grass to tell them about her week. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she laughed, remembering the funny things they'd said or done. Always, she told them they were loved, that they mattered, that their short lives had changed the world in ways they'd never know. Dan Marsh never returned to government work. He testified at 3 more trials, helped expose 2 additional contaminated sites, and became a consultant for environmental advocacy groups. His marriage survived, though Jennifer said later that the man who came through the trial wasn't quite the same man who'd entered it. Harder in some ways, softer in others, but fundamentally more honest about who he was and what he'd done. Emma grew up knowing her father's story. Dan told her on her 10th birthday, age-appropriate but truthful, about the mistake he'd made and the price other families paid. "I want you to understand," he'd said, "that good people can do terrible things when they don't ask enough questions, and that spending the rest of your life trying to make it right doesn't erase the harm, but it matters anyway." Sarah Martinez stayed in Portland, but became an activist, speaking at schools and community centers about environmental justice. Her 2 living children grew up proud of their mother's courage, though they also understood the shadow of the brother they'd never met, whose picture hung in their hallway, alongside their own. Marcus Chen lived 3 more years, long enough to see the settlement finalized and Lynn's name inscribed on a memorial erected near the former Sunny Meadows site. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1984, and in his will, he left his portion of the settlement to an environmental education fund in Lynn's name. Patricia Torres took on 6 more cases using the Donovan precedent, winning 4 and forcing settlements on the other 2. She never charged the families a cent, and the Silver Spur diner? It stayed open. Frank eventually sold it to Claire in 1983, selling it for $1 with the understanding that she'd keep the coffee strong and the doors open to anyone who needed a quiet place to exist without questions. She hired 2 new waitresses, both survivors of different tragedies, both needing work that didn't require explaining themselves, and slowly built something like a family from the shared understanding that some wounds never fully heal, but can be tended with patience and grace. The diner became known, in quiet circles, as a place where people running from something could catch their breath, where silence was respected but kindness was always offered. Where the coffee was bitter, but the waitress might smile if you were lucky. On the 10-year anniversary of Sophie and Michael's deaths, Claire stood in the diner after closing, looking at the photograph Frank had taken, the one that had appeared in the Las Vegas Sun. Her younger self stared back, raw and broken and brave in ways she hadn't fully understood at the time. She'd kept the waitress uniform, still wore it most days, though she didn't have to anymore. It had become something else over the years. Not armor or disguise, but simply clothing. A part of her story that no longer defined the whole. The door chimed. Claire turned, ready to say they were closed, but stopped when she saw who it was. A woman in her early 30s, thin and exhausted, with a canvas bag and desperation in her eyes. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "I saw the light. I need somewhere to think. Somewhere safe. Just for a minute." Claire recognized that look, that posture, the weight of someone carrying losses too heavy for their frame. "Sit," Claire said, gesturing to a booth. "I'll make coffee." "I can't pay." "Don't worry about that. Just sit." While the coffee brewed, Claire studied the woman in the reflection of the chrome napkin dispenser. Saw herself a decade ago. Saw every person who'd ever walked through those doors needing grace they couldn't ask for directly. "I'm Claire," she said, setting down 2 cups. "Anna." The woman wrapped her hands around the cup like it was a lifeline. "I don't usually... I'm not..." She stopped, starting over. Something happened. Something bad. And I don't know who to talk to, or what to do, or how to... Her voice cracked. "You don't have to explain," Claire said gently. "Not unless you want to." They sat in silence for a while. 2 women in an empty diner, drinking coffee while the Nevada night pressed against the windows. Eventually, Anna spoke. Told her story in fragments. A chemical spill at a factory where her husband worked. Illnesses the company denied were connected. Deaths ruled accidental. Paperwork that made speaking out a crime. Claire listened. She didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. She just listened, the way Frank had listened to her once upon a time in this same booth, making space for truth to exist without judgment. When Anna finished, Claire reached across the table and took her hand. "You're not alone," she said. "And whatever you decide to do next, you don't have to decide tonight. You can stay, rest, think. And when you're ready, if you want help, I know some people." Anna's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Claire thought about Sophie and Michael, about the long road from silence to speech, about the way grief could either destroy you or, impossibly, make you more human. "Because someone helped me once," she said. "And because some stories deserve to be told, even when they're hard, especially when they're hard." They talked until dawn, and when Anna finally left, she had Patricia Torres's phone number, the names of 3 advocacy groups, and the knowledge that she wasn't crazy, wasn't alone, wasn't powerless. Claire locked the diner and walked home through the early morning light, past the gas station and the hardware store, and all the familiar landmarks of a life rebuilt from ashes. She still thought about Sophie and Michael every day, still carried the weight of what had been lost, but she also carried forward their names, their story, the changes their deaths had forced into being. The smile came easier now. Not always, not every day, but enough. To this day, locals in that part of Nevada will tell you about the waitress at the Silver Spur who never used to smile. Some say she lost her family to government negligence. Others say she brought down an entire department with nothing but truth and stubbornness. A few claim that if you're running from something and need help, She's the person to find, though the diner's been closed for years now. Claire Donovan having finally retired in 2003 at the age of 54. But on certain nights, travelers swear they see lights on in the old building, smell fresh coffee brewing, and if they're desperate enough to knock, sometimes, just sometimes, the door opens. And a woman with kind eyes and a sad smile asks if they need somewhere safe to think. If this story moved you, honor the real survivors of environmental injustice by learning about contamination issues in your own community. Subscribe for more untold stories, and share this video with someone who needs to know that speaking truth to power, no matter how long it takes, always matters.